Turn your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. We're going to look at verses 8 through 12 in a moment. So you come to Mother's Day, and I was talking to Mom the other day, and Mom's 79 now. But I really reflect on what she taught me when I was in the house. My mom was a public school educator. And where I grew up out in the country, there were 3 girls out of those 8 houses or 9 houses. And then there was this tassel of boys, okay? And to say the least, we might have been a little rough around the edges. We got along pretty well most of the time, but not all the time. We were boys. And one of the things, you come in mad from whatever happened out in the woods or out in somebody's yard playing ball. And it all came back to about how I treated my friends. Not whether I won or lost or whether I was right or wrong. It all came back to how I had responded. That's more often than not where I got in trouble. About how I responded. Where Mom looked at you and she said, you're going to want to see Stevie again. I just named his mother, by the way. Okay? As somebody who played a major role in my life. Okay? Yeah, it happened. And that was always part of it. And I saw it with her. She taught at J.L. High School. It was the preppy high school in Greenville County. If you remember the days of Izod and bright patterned clothes. But yet, even in that high school, they had the haves and the have-nots. Okay? And how you treated. And my mom taught math, and so she had some really smart kids because she taught Cal. And my mom always kept a class of general math. Because I was grading her papers by the time I was in middle school. And so how she treated, it was interesting because I would meet those people. And it doesn't matter if you were the smartest kid or you were the kid that struggled. And how she treated them and their parents. And it was always interesting to see that lived out. And so it is always important about how we treat others. And this passage out of 1 Peter goes from here into suffering, about how we suffer for Jesus. We're not going to do the suffering thing on Mother's Day, okay? But it says part of that, of how we go through life, even when we're struggling. It says how we ought to treat people around us. And so we have these... We have social networks, don't we? We all do. We have them through work. We have them through school. We have them through church, community, family. And heaven help social media. Most people I know do some form of social media or have. And so we have this spot of context of how we interact with all these different people. And many times you'll hear us say, who you know matters in life, right? And it does. But I would tell you how you have interacted with those people that you know will impact those relationships. That part matters. So, here's the big idea before we even read the verses. God likes true social networking. Now let's hear how we work into that. Peter says, finally, all of you be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing. Because to do this, we were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. Verse 10 through 12 is a quote out of the Old Testament. It's out of Psalms. Whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Is it true that God really likes social networking? He does when it's done right. See, true Christian fellowship and interaction happens in our personal, social interactions. And those interactions are dictated by godly responses. How we respond to other people says a lot about who we are and whose we are. My daddy always reminded me who I was. He says, in my case, I carried his full name. John Clarence Elmore. He had senior, I had junior. Our son carries the third. He reminded me, he goes, when you go into this community, remember who you are. See, how we respond to people always matters. That first part, he says, I want you to be like-minded, to be in mind of unity, of going together. When we seek to join people, it changes how we interact with them. I was gone with a group of those who will be ordained, in my case, have my ordination recognized at the annual conference this past week. And I was sitting with a guy that's the age of JC. He's a pastor. His name's Joseph. I was sitting with a guy who's 5 or 7 years older than me. His name's Pete. We're both second career. I'm chatty. Pete's an engineer. He's quiet. But the neatest thing to ever hang out with Pete is his ability to listen. He listens. I was trying to listen to Joseph better than normal. And then Pete, all of a sudden, he stopped, and across the campfire that night, he asked the question, and it was just clear as day. And it wasn't to get the new preacher who's only been in an appointment 2 years. It was to help move him. He nudged him just a little bit with this poignant question and brought him back to what we're called to do and what we'd spent most of our days together. When we seek to find those spots where we can be like-minded and move together, it changes how we are. It's a whole lot easier to walk arm in arm with somebody than it is to be tugging and pulling, isn't it? Do you want to walk with somebody who's got their arm out and says, let's go together? And sometimes we like to walk alone. I get it. But as Christians, we are called. And in life, we're called to go with people. Because when we do, it changes their lives. It says for us to be sympathetic, compassionate, that listening piece, extra grace. I'm going to give you all a few Forrest Gump quotes today. Mama always said dying was a part of life. I sure wish it wasn't. But the reality is it's there. It's part of it. I'm always mindful that part of being sympathetic, we understand a little better. But when people are under extra stress, maybe it's mama's illness. Maybe we're stressed because the kids are going 90 miles a minute and I can't figure out how to bump life into neutral. Maybe it is that our parents are getting a little older and we're facing tough decisions about what to do as health changes. Maybe it's that the kids are leaving. We're going to be empty nest for the first time in over 20 some odd years. But when people are under stress, lots of times we've been through those spots. And sometimes y'all know how the responses come back, right? They're under stress and they snap a little, they say something that's you wish they'd have said a different way. But when we're sympathetic to when we have listened to where they are in life, it's easier to give a little extra grace because we know what they're going through. And you go, yeah, that's about the stress. It's not about our relationship. So our sympathy isn't just for that moment of grief. And by the way, I think that's one of the spots where I always tell folks, it's like, there ought to be some extra grace today. Because the reality is our world says we should be back to normal in a hurry. And most of you in the corporate world, at most you get 3 days to grieve. Grief doesn't happen that fast. And depending on how old we are or how young we are, we have seen a lot or a little. Those first times we face it, like the folks at the academy, where we're not expecting it, it's harder. Those situations. And so when all of a sudden we can put that arm around somebody and listen to them and show them a little extra love in the midst of their stresses, that is good social networking. And people remember that. I talked to a former church member this week, and her husband passed last Sunday. Just called her just to say, hey, I'm thinking about you and praying. And she remembered something I did. I had forgotten about it. I went and split wood for them at their house. And see, when we go, those little extra things matter. Being sympathetic of what they are. Her husband had, at that time, had gotten where he couldn't do that. And they like to have a fire. So I went and split wood. See, those pieces of just being a little sympathetic, a little extra caring matter. There's a pattern in verse 8. It's in the linchpin of it is the center point, is to love one another. You know, as Christians, I'm always mindful. Y'all ever been around when Christians disagree? You should bob your heads up and down. Most of us have been there. I've been in the room a couple times in life where you're like, wait a second, am I in a Christian meeting? Okay? But the reality is how we love each other, again, comes back to that whole morsel of who am I? When we can't love each other in the midst of struggles, I'm hurt because we have forgotten exactly who we are. Jesus serves communion and breaks bread with Judas knowing what is about to happen. He's hanging on the cross and offers forgiveness for the soldiers. In the midst of it, where one guy is hollering, get us off of here. The other's like, don't you see this is the Son of God? Jesus is still offering grace in the midst of his dying. Man, how much more should we be willing to love each other? Right now, the name is, I'm slipping. There's a missionary couple that went into Africa. The husband is killed by the tribe. The wife gets out. It takes several years, but she actually comes back again with the gospel to the very tribe that had killed her husband. We ought to love each other. Most of us haven't ever been in that spot there, but we ought to be willing to love our brothers and sisters. Because it says something about it. And that spot, I mean, that's just over and over. It's in the Old Testament, New Testament, wherever you want to look, it's part of love somebody because Christ has loved you. It says we ought to be tenderhearted, compassionate, is not one of my strengths. My gut reaction, so this will make pastoral counseling a little challenging. My gut reaction in life is to put on your big boy britches and go. Personality skills, compassion is one of those things that I tend to rank low at. It's a learned trait for me. It is a growing in faith trait for me. It's something I have to learn because of who my Savior is. It's very much in that sympathetic. We ought to be compassionate about other people. We ought to be willing to serve and to go. Do we show compassion, or are we still snarling when somebody cuts us off at the Piggly Wiggly and we're in a hurry? I don't do well when you cut me off at the Chick-fil-A line. I'm like, it's my turn. I should be in front of you. Instead of honking my horn and being frustrated, how should I pray for that person? How can I show care? See, our compassion matters. It tells us to be humble, or sometimes and we've talked about humble, but sometimes, and this happens to me, people are like, I want to prove my worth and be a person, as opposed to my friend I was talking about, Pete, who was just listening. Letting everybody else have the idea or get to the same spot. Maybe you're the one who encourages them. You don't always have to be right. And that is something I'm still learning. But I will say I am learning. There's some things it's okay. But see, when I'm not humble, I can't ever come to that spot. It comes back to, no, it's this way. 1 and 1 is 3. Did y'all catch that? Y'all awake? 1 and 1 is not 3. Okay. Listen at 9. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. Repay evil with a blessing. Because this you are called, and from this you will inherit a blessing. That's hard. First 2 names I wrote down, I thought of Martin Luther King. He always was nonviolence in his response to what he stood for. But he was always working and always active. And he faced much evil. Second name I wrote down was Nelson Mandela. They faced many atrocities and challenges. They were both, Mandela was put in prison. Martin Luther King was ultimately killed for who he was. But they stood up. Jesus, in the midst of all of this, gave us this great example over and over. The Pharisees are calling him out. And who's he meeting with in John 3? Nicodemus, a Pharisee. The one verse I would bet you had memorized, John 3:16, is Jesus is responding to somebody who's out of the group of people who will ultimately bring about his death. How much more should we be willing to offer a blessing? When you're sitting in the meeting or the family situation and somebody finally loses it, my natural response is, I'm going to put you in your place, right? I'm going to let you hold this one. But if I just get just as red-faced and just as angry Does it help? Because the reality is I found, and this is against my nature, is to sit and take that one on the chin. And then I have a spot to speak from and a strength to speak from without hurting them and trying to bring back what we're supposed to do. To bless others instead of get even is hard. But you think if you lived out these 5 traits in your social networking or how you deal with other people, that's something God would always like. That would something that others would say, that is a follower of Christ. And so it's a challenge sometimes. But yet when we walk in those spots, God can use our responses. Miss Gump said, you have to do the best with what God gave you. The reality is He gave us a pattern of how we should treat others and how we should care for them. And when that happens, it starts to look more like Christ than it does John or whatever your first name is. Because it's more about Him than us. Those last 2 verses, He says, keep your tongue from evil. Do I take that brother and sister, and by the way, the Methodist Church in the midst of the upheaval? I will tell you, I find myself conflicted because there's going to be a separation in the Methodist Church, one way or the other. Whichever side you stand on, think on, I'm okay. But the amazing thing to me is I think we should love each other through it. We should be willing to offer grace. We shouldn't be talking bad about either side. Because, see, that's the Christian response. It says we have to turn from evil. We have to pursue peace. And ultimately, we have to seek the Lord. Have to pray. See, the reality is when we live in those spots, that's godly social networking. That's the Christian response is to how we treat people. We are called to interact with people. We're not called to be in isolation. So how is it that you're going to turn and treat the people around you that you interact with? A godly way? Or we're going to respond out of our natural being? And those are hard to change and to challenge. But because of who you are, it ought to be. There's at the very beginning of verse 10, it talks about a blessing. Okay? And in the Old Testament, when they talk about, especially out of the Psalms, that blessing is the eternal blessing. And I think that part is there. But I think also when we treat people properly, there's a current blessing. Because when we're known for treating people well, we're blessed by it. And it'll come back to us. Because people will see that. Remember I told you, we talk about who you know in this world matters. But how you treat the people you know matters. And so when I have those good interactions, and I have that spot where I have treated them with trust and love, compassion and sympathy, do you know what? It opens doors for me to experience blessings. Maybe it's just friendship. Maybe it's something else. But I do believe when we follow these Christian traits, we see blessings on both sides. Or we stand an opportunity to. I know we'll see the eternal blessings. Okay? So know that God is looking forward to seeing how we treat those around us. Because He does like our Christian responses in our social networking. He gives us much of that and taught much of that through our moms. Let me pray for you today. Heavenly Father, may we respond with your heart when it is challenging. May we respond to the out of the grace that you have poured out on us. May we offer forgiveness as we have been forgiven. And may we love the world around us and its people as you love them. Amen.